Author George R. Martin enjoys not knowing what is going to happen next.
So, you originally thought there would be 3 books in the series that begins with A Game of Thrones, and that each book would take a year or so to write.
Yes. I was young and foolish in those days.
That was 20 years ago.
Oh, God. More than 20 years ago, actually. I think 1991 I started writing this. I actually didn't know how many books or whether there would be any books when I started writing it. Maybe this is a short story. Maybe it's a novella. At a certain point, I decided it was a novel, and then pretty clearly jumped to trilogy because I knew it was an epic fantasy.
So you could have written lavish and fascinating and beautiful historical fiction and kept it pretty straight. What is it about fantasy that lured you to it?
Well, Tolkien had a big part to do it. I mean, I read Tolkien and at a very early age, and it's still one of my favorite books. I reread it every few years. It produces feelings in me that very few other books have ever done. I do love historical fiction, but I also have a problem with it, and that's that I've also read a lot of history, so I know what's going to happen. I mean, as Game of Thrones, many people rightly pointed out, is based at least in part on the Wars of the Roses. I've read a lot about the War of the Roses. I've read a lot of the popular histories of the period, and I've read a lot of historical fiction about the Wars of the Roses, and I've enjoyed it. There's some very good versions out there. But the problem is I always know what's going to happen. I know who's going to win every battle we're approaching. I know the ultimate fate of those princes in the tower. I like not knowing what's going to happen.
If
and
you
I
put
like
dragons
my readers
and
not
giants
knowing
in,
what's going to happen. Yes.
that allows you to throw it off track?
Well, just by making it something that's based on the Wars of the Roses, but not an actual account, you can mix things up. You can move things around. So much as I like reading historical fiction, I don't think I would like to write it because the history hamstrings you. You know, I think the best books give you a vicarious experience. Certainly when you're reading them, you know you're sitting in a chair or lying in bed or on a couch or something and you're reading a book. You know that, certainly. But 10 years later, if the book is powerful enough, you will remember the events of the book almost as if you lived them, and you will no longer remember the couch or where you read them or whatever, because the world will have faded, the real world will have faded, but the fictional world will exist.
The pictures that you created in your mind of the characters and the places, they come back to you when you think of the book.
Yes, and they come back to you almost as real characters. I mean, I read Lord of the Rings, which is one of the first books that really had that effect on me, I guess it would be like junior high school. I don't recall precisely. But I remember Frodo and Sam and Gandalf and Strider as if they were people that I knew. I don't remember who was sitting in front of me in the classes that I went to every day during that same period, or who was sitting behind me or across the aisle or that. I've forgotten even the names of 3/4 of my junior high school classmates. But I remember these made-up fictional people, and that's the effect that the most powerful fiction can have on us. And that's what I strive to in my fiction, I'll never achieve it, but, one's reach should exceed one's gasp. But I want people to feel as if they lived what they're reading in my book. I want to put them there in the moment, in the scene, in Westeros, in King's Landing, in Winterfell, and let them feel all the emotions the characters are feeling. Let them feel the fear and the suspense and the joy and whatever is going on. That's always been my goal as a writer, because that's what I want as a reader. And I think all writers are readers first, of course.
Is that how you learn to write, by reading?
I think you learn to write by writing, but certainly you want to write by reading. I mean, I've been doing both since I was quite small. My mother read to me when I was little, and at some point I started reading by myself. I read comic books primarily when I was a small kid, which I loved. In the 1950s, when I was growing up, the stuff they had you read in school would almost turn you off reading. I remember reading those books about Dick and Jane, and these were the dullest people in the world, and and for a kid living in Bayonne, New Jersey, in the very urban environment, you know, playing stickball in the streets with parked cars as the bases and things like that. This kind of suburban neighborhood that Dick and Jane lived in, it was like people from an alien planet. The people on Mars and Robert A. Heinlein's books that I came to later had more, spoke to me more than Dick and Jane and Little Sally and their dog Spot. But those were terrible stories, and I always thought that was a bad way to get people to read. But Batman and Superman and you know, Archie and all the comic book characters, those were good stories. At least I thought so at the time.
You kill a lot of characters.
No, I don't. The other characters kill the characters. I'm an innocent bystander.
But do you ever regret it? Do you ever have one die and then want to bring them back?
You know, I do bring some of them back. But, you know, they're not quite the same. Death changes a person. Usually not for the better, too. Although I'm not a writer who outlines every word before he writes it, I do have a general sense of where the story is going, and I know who's going to live and who's going to die and when they're going to die. It's sometimes hard to write those scenes because when you write a character for a long time, they become a friend almost, or at least a friend you love to hate, and it's hard to say goodbye to them. There's some emotion involved, and some of those scenes can be difficult to write, but I never questioned my decision to kill a character. It's all part of the story that I've been telling since the beginning. And you know, the story is about a great war, the War of the Five Kings, leading into the larger wars, the Wars of Ice and Fire. And when you're writing about war, if you're going to be honest about it, I think there's a moral obligation on the part of the writer to present war truthfully, with all the ugliness that comes with it, the violence and the rape and the grief and the pain. You look at the real wars in the real world, whether you're talking about the 100 Years' War or the Crusades or Vietnam or World War II, and no matter who you're fighting or what happens during the war, the people who come back from it are changed and damaged, and a lot of people don't come back from it. And they weren't just the extras who didn't come back. People's fathers, people's sons, people's best friends and blood brothers went off to war and they don't come back. So if you're going to write with war as the center of your piece, as is true not only of my books, but of 90% of the epic fantasy that's out there, has war at the center of it, then you better kill people or you're lying.
I'm thinking of Tyrion Lannister, who is the son of a lord and a dwarf. What does that physical characteristic allow you to explore in his character?
Well, a lot of my characters, my main viewpoint characters in the book, and I have about a dozen of them that I take you actually inside their head so you can see the world through their eyes and hear their thoughts and feel what they're feeling, hopefully. Almost all of my viewpoint characters are outcasts in some way from the society that they live in. They're disadvantaged in one way or another. Tyrion, being a dwarf, is one of the more extreme examples. But you see it in the others. I mean, Sam Tarly is very fat, and that gets him a lot of disdain. Brienne of Tarth is a huge, strong, masculine woman who wants to fight and not be a lady and won't wear dresses and wants to put on armor instead. Jon Snow is a bastard. You know, he's got all the tools to be a great knight and a great warrior, but the taint of his birth haunts him and follows him through all the days. Daenerys Targaryen, perhaps one of the most fortunate in that she has the dragons and she has the Targaryen heritage, which is, you know, an extreme, almost inhuman beauty with the silver gold hair and the purple eyes. And the Targaryens are a very good-looking family, but she's an exile. She's a penniless exile when the books began, and she's sold into a forced marriage without any will of her own to a barbarian warlord, in exchange for an army for her brother and the promise of military aid. So everybody has some of these crosses to deal with. And I find characters like that who are out of step with the society or the culture that they live in, who have some problem, some difficulty, most interesting to write about than the person who has everything, the golden boy. And I have had a few golden boys and golden girls and people like Jaime and Cersei, but even there they have secrets that they have to deal with, and things occur to them where they lose their goldenness. I won't give away too much about that, since there are people out there who haven't read the books, and hopefully they should discover this for themselves.
Your characters are very complicated, and you spend a lot of time in the gray area, challenging our perceptions of good and evil. What interests you about this space?
I don't see any pure heroes. I don't see any pure villains. I mean, as an adult and even in college and all that, I would read biographies of the people who are considered the greatest heroes of our society. When you're a child, they tell you these stories about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the other great heroes, Lincoln or whatever, and then make them seem perfect, heroic, and maybe that's the first way we should teach it to very young children. But then when you get a little older, and if you're curious enough, you read more about their lives and say, yeah, these were great men, but they were great men who had flaws. Lincoln was despondent, subject to bouts of depression. Jefferson having his affair with Sally Hemings and, fathering children on her and yet not freeing them. And, all of the, and does this diminish their greatness? Do we really expect all of our great men to be absolutely perfect paragons? I don't see any paragons anywhere, and I don't see people who are completely black and evil. So I love complex characters, and because I think not only are they more interesting, but they're more real. All of us are complex. All of us have it within us to be heroes, and all of us have it within us to be villains. We've all done good things, and we've all done selfish things, and we've all hurt other people and all that. And we do this all the time. We go through our lives doing it. And that's, to my mind, that's what being a human being is all about. And I love to write about human beings.
Is ethics something that intrigues you?
Yes, I ethics, morality, the whole question of right and wrong, of heroism and villainy. These are all issues. I mean, I've always taken as my writing mantra what William Faulkner said in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he said the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself, and I believe that. And that's what you see in Game of Thrones, and hopefully in many of my other earlier works as well. And that exists in all good literature, I believe. Genre doesn't matter. I mean, I've worked primarily in genres of science fiction and fantasy, to some extent in horror, and I read a lot in those genres, but I also read in many other genres, from literary fiction and classics of literature, mystery novels, thrillers, historical fiction. I love historical fiction. And genre doesn't matter, whether it has spaceships in it or vampires or dragons. Still, it can't be about the spaceships. It has to be about the people on the spaceship, the human heart in conflict with itself. It can't be about the castle or the dragon. It has to be about the dragon's mother, in the case of Daenerys, and what she chooses to do with the immense power conferred on her by these engines of destruction that have been put into her hands. That's where my interest lies, the human heart in conflict with itself.